As we saw in Part 1, the first couple of years of Richard Nixon's presidency were filled with challenges. He campaigned on many areas. The most important politically was his plan to end American involvement in Vietnam. He also had a history of international diplomacy, which would continue, but he would face far more serious challenges at home and overseas. His many reforms were met with both support and skepticism. All of these were undeniably transforming the nation and shifting the political landscape. Here in Part 2, we will look at other more serious issues that he had to deal with, and how these events shaped his second administration and forever altered perceptions of the presidency. What were Nixon's greatest accomplishments? What were his greatest challenges? And what were his greatest failures? Hello, I'm Colin Heaton, military veteran, historian, and author, and welcome to this episode of Forgotten History, where we are continuing our series on the most corrupt with Richard Nixon. Nixon created what he called New Federalism, to provide state and local governments with billions of federal tax dollars to be distributed for public works, public safety, and education programs. Nixon also abolished voter discrimination tests, such as literacy tests and other insane methods to keep poor whites and especially uneducated blacks from voting by extending the 1965 Voting Rights Act in 1970. Despite his highly touted support for both civil rights and voting rights, which he opposed as a senator, Lyndon Johnson refused to do the same to ensure the security of black votes to vote without restrictions. LBJ signed the Civil Rights and Voting Rights Acts into law for public consumption, but had no intention of following through to make sure they would be followed. Nixon was still handling his plan to get the U.S. out of Vietnam, and Vietnamization was his policy. American and Allied troops would leave, but the country would still supply South Vietnam with weapons, air support, and other materiel. In 1970, he authorized the invasion of U.S. and South Vietnamese forces, who attacked North Vietnamese sanctuaries in Cambodia, technically a neutral nation, but supporting North Vietnam. This included the entire route along the Ho Chi Minh Trail, where the communists resupplied their forces and then retreated to safety after contact. As a result, there were widespread protests around the country, and the most famous was at Kent State University on May 4, 1970. Soldiers of the Ohio National Guard fired into a crowd of around 2,000 protesters, killing 4 and wounding 9. It became world news. Nixon was still trying to deal with the U.S. economy, and he attempted to limit federal spending, and by 1971 his budget proposals included deficits of several billion dollars, which was the largest in American history up to that time. In August 1971, Nixon presented his new economic policy to address inflation, unemployment, and the nation's increased trade deficit. The dollar lost 8 cents in value, and there were new import taxes. He also pushed temporary wage and price controls to assist the economy, worked for a short time, and things slightly improved. But when that ended, inflation rose to 12.2% by 1974. In 1971, badly needing a public relations boost, Nixon declared war on cancer, launching a $100 million campaign to help fund and find a cure for cancer. Nixon signed Title IX in 1972, adding to civil rights law that provided women the same opportunities at sports scholarships without discrimination at colleges and universities if they received any federal aid. Nixon did manage a major achievement in foreign affairs by establishing direct relations with the People's Republic of China after 21 years without any direct contact. There had been many low-level diplomatic contacts in 1970, and Nixon lifted U.S. trade and travel restrictions the following year. Given the opportunity to become a trading partner, the Chinese notified Nixon that they would welcome high-level discussions, and Nixon sent Henry Kissinger to China for secret talks. This became known as ping-pong diplomacy, due to the American and Chinese table tennis teams visiting each other in competition in 1971 to 72. Nixon's visits to China in February and March of 1972 were the first by an American president while in office, which concluded with the Shanghai Communique, in which the United States formally recognized the One China principle. This states that there is only one China and that Taiwan is a part of China. And that is still a point of contention today, as it is still U.S. foreign policy. Just before the election in November 1968, Lyndon Johnson had suspended Operation Rolling Thunder, the bombing in North Vietnam, which was a response to the Tet Offensive. But he had launched this operation after the North Vietnamese crossed the DMZ and attacked the South on March 30th, 1972. But operations such as this were renewed after the North Vietnamese crossed the DMZ and attacked the South on March 30th, 1972. Nixon took decisive action, authorizing massive air operations on April 5, 1972, and it picked up momentum on April 10th with a massive B-52 strikes along with naval assets. The Air Force and Navy commanders and pilots were very relieved that Nixon had not interfered with the operational planning. He allowed the operational commanders to plot their targets and schedule their missions as they saw fit, something LBJ never did, and casualties rose as a result, especially during Operation Rolling Thunder. On May 9th, he accelerated the bombing program with Operation Linebacker, as well as bombing Cambodia and Laos, and it lasted until October 23, 1972. It was so effective, the North Vietnamese wanted to have a meeting. Nixon wanted to bomb Haiphong, Hanoi, and everything from the DMZ north, but Henry Kissinger convinced him not to do it, as he was scheduled to have the SALT agreement talks in the Soviet Union. But he did authorize the aerial bombing of ports such as Haiphong. Although he had visited the USSR before, Nixon became the first American president to make an official visit to the Soviet Union in 1972, and he attended the Summit 1 in Moscow with Soviet General Secretary Brezhnev. Both men signed the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty and Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, known as SALT I. In October 1972, after Linebacker had ended, National Security Advisor Henry Kissinger and North Vietnamese Foreign Minister Le Duc Tho met in Paris, France, and they reached an agreement where Kissinger announced, "Peace is at hand." However, the South Vietnamese government has serious issues with the process, and the agreement broke down. As a result of the breakdown in negotiations, Nixon launched Operation Linebacker II. This was an intensive 11-day bombing campaign of Hanoi, Haiphong, and other North Vietnamese cities in late December. This became known as the Christmas bombings. Once again, after being rocked yet again, the North Vietnamese offered to engage in more negotiations. An agreement was finally reached in January 1973, and Nixon ended the war in Vietnam by signing the Paris Peace Accords. The agreement included an immediate ceasefire, the withdrawal of all American and Allied military personnel, but most important to Nixon, the release and accountability of all prisoners of war, and the inclusion of an international force to keep the peace. Kissinger and Tho were awarded the 1973 Nobel Peace Prize, though Tho declined to accept the award. Kissinger and Tho were awarded the 1973 Nobel Prize for Peace, though Tho declined to accept the award. On May 24, 1973, Nixon hosted the largest dinner ever held at the White House to welcome the American POWs from Vietnam home. While Nixon was enjoying his success with the North Vietnamese, there was a major problem at home and in the Middle East. Vice President Spiro Agnew was under investigation for tax fraud, graft, extortion, and receiving kickbacks from construction companies from when he was governor of Maryland. What sealed his fate was when the documents from these companies showed that he was still getting kickbacks on shady contracts while he was vice president. Facing serious prison time if convicted on all charges, state and federal, Agnew entered into a plea deal that resulted in his resignation. He was then replaced by Senator Gerald R. Ford. Agnew was then disbarred as an attorney. While this was going on, Israel was at war with Egypt, Jordan, and Syria in the 1973 Yom Kippur War. Nixon had launched the Rogers Plan, named for Nixon's first Secretary of State, William Rogers, to bring peace to the region. It was rejected by both Israel and the Soviet Union. After the Yom Kippur War, Kissinger's many trips back and forth, called shuttle diplomacy between the Arab states and Israel, helped to negotiate a cessation of hostilities. U.S. relations with the Arab nations took a hit as the U.S. was seen to be too pro-Israel. Nixon was very concerned about communist incursions into Latin America, which had been occurring since the 1950s, and Chile was at the top of the list. Allende, who was elected in 1970 in what was considered one of the most fraudulent elections in history, nationalized American-owned mining companies, broke contracts, and confiscated property. In response, Nixon restricted Chile's access to international economic assistance and discouraged tourism travel, private investment, and stopped military aid. Then Nixon, with the CIA, assisted in the overthrow of communist President Salvador Allende. They had good contacts with anti-Allende elements in the police, secret police, and military, and secretly sent millions of dollars to opposition groups between 1970 and 1973. Finally, due to the military and police, Allende was overthrown in a military coup led by the pro-American and anti-communist commander-in-chief of the army, General Augusto Pinochet, in September 1973. In the end, Pinochet turned out to be just as bad, if not worse, than Allende. However, the greatest threat to Nixon's presidency and legacy was the Watergate scandal. The bungled burglary and wiretapping of the national headquarters of the Democratic Party at the Watergate office complex in Washington, D.C. was bad enough, but it was the subsequent cover-up attempt that really brought the whole event crashing down. Former CIA agent E. Howard Hunt recruited 4 of the 5 men involved, and all were working for the Republican Party's committee to re-elect the president. Those involved were arrested and charged on June 17, 1972. Among the senior men involved in the scandal were G. Gordon Liddy, the former FBI agent and general counsel for the committee to re-elect the president. He was convicted of burglary, conspiracy, and wiretapping and sentenced to 6 years and 8 months in prison, but only served 4.5 years in prison. James W. McCord Jr. was a former CIA officer and FBI agent, convicted on 8 counts of conspiracy, burglary, and wiretapping. He was sentenced to 25 years in prison, reduced to 1 to 5 years in prison, after he implicated others in the plot and served only 4 months. Frank Sturgis was a CIA undercover operative and guerrilla trainer and military veteran. He was convicted of conspiracy, burglary, and wiretapping, and separately on a charge of transporting stolen cars to Mexico. He was sentenced to 1 to 4 years in prison for Watergate, with the sentence for the transport charge being included into the Watergate sentence due to his cooperation, and he served 14 months in prison. The next day after the arrest, Nixon secretly instructed John Dean, who was the White House counsel, to supposedly handle the cover-up to conceal his administration's complicity. Nixon also obstructed the Federal Bureau of Investigation as it investigated the crimes and authorized secret cash payments to all those involved in an effort to buy their silence and prevent them from implicating the administration. The largest newspapers in the country each lost their own investigations into the possible White House involvement. The Washington Post had the best gains on the story through the efforts of Carl Bernstein and Bob Woodward. Their reports relied primarily on information from an unnamed source they called Deep Throat. Deep Throat's identity became its own major news story and led to decades of speculation as to who the mysterious source was. In 2005, W. Mark Felt, a top-ranking FBI official at the time, came forward and revealed that he was Deep Throat. The Select Committee on Presidential Campaign Activities started in February 1973, chaired by Senator Sam Ervin. Their mission was to investigate what, if any, involvement the White House had in the scandal. They also wanted to look into Nixon's special task force known as the Plumbers, whose job it was to locate and neutralize leaks from the administration to news outlets. The entire process was televised live, and the president's lawyer, John Dean, implicated Nixon in the cover-up, and other witnesses testified to other illegal activities conducted by the administration and even the campaign staff. They also claimed that federal agencies were employed to harass those persons on Nixon's enemies list, which included many prominent politicians, journalists, entertainers, academics, and a few corporate business owners, most of whom supported the Democrats. During the proceedings, the committee learned in July that Nixon had installed a recording system in the White House in 1969, and that all the president's conversations in the Oval Office had been recorded, and the tapes were subpoenaed by the special prosecutor, Archibald Cox. Nixon refused to comply with the subpoena and hand over the tapes. but he offered to provide summary transcripts instead, which Cox refused to accept. What followed was called the Saturday Night Massacre, when Nixon ordered Attorney General Elliot Richardson to fire Cox, and rather than comply with the illegal order, Richardson resigned. In retaliation, Nixon fired William Ruckelshaus, who was Richardson's assistant, after he also refused to fire Cox, who was finally removed by Solicitor General Robert Bork, but that decision was challenged in the federal district court that ruled the firing was illegal. Nixon attempted damage control by offering to replace the fired Cox with Leon Jaworski and promising not to fire him without congressional approval. The national press was in a feeding frenzy. Nixon, in a news conference, famously said, "I am not a crook," and he did eventually release 7 of the 9 tapes. There was one tape that had a suspicious gap of 18½ minutes, which raised suspicions, but none of the tapes provided any evidence that Nixon had ordered the burglary or was involved in an attempt to obstruct justice. Later, Jaworski subpoenaed 64 tapes that Nixon refused to relinquish, claiming executive privilege. But in July 1974, the Supreme Court ruled unanimously that executive privilege was invalid in a criminal case. The House Judiciary Committee voted to recommend 3 articles of impeachment relating to the charges of obstruction of justice, abuse of power, and failure to comply with congressional subpoenas. Then, on August 5th, with no choice but to comply with the Supreme Court's ruling, Nixon submitted transcripts of a conversation taped on June 23, 1972. The conversation proved Nixon's plan to use the Central Intelligence Agency to block the FBI's investigation of the Watergate break-in, which was the cover-up. Knowing that he would not emerge from an impeachment successfully, Nixon announced his resignation on television to millions of Americans on the evening of August 8, 1974, to become effective at noon the next day. Vice President Gerald Ford, who replaced former Vice President Spiro Agnew in 1973, then pardoned Richard M. Nixon on September 8, 1974. President Richard and Mrs. Nixon had 2 daughters, Tricia and Julie. Tricia married Edward Cox. Julie married David Eisenhower, grandson of America's 34th President, General Dwight D. Eisenhower. Nixon retired with his wife to the seclusion of his estate in San Clemente, California. Nixon became a prolific author and wrote 10 bestsellers on domestic and international affairs, as well as his memoirs. One was R.N., The Memoirs of Richard Nixon, published in 1978. His efforts worked at rehabilitating his public image and reputation, establishing him as a former statesman and foreign policy expert. Nixon spent his last years campaigning for American political support and financial aid for Russia and other former Soviet republics in the belief that they would eventually throw off communism. Pat Nixon died of lung cancer in 1993, and Richard Nixon died of a massive stroke in New York City on April 22, 1994. After his death, many dignitaries around the world paid their respects. Presidents Bill Clinton, James Earl Carter, Gerald Ford, George H.W. Bush, among many others, celebrated his many diplomatic achievements. Richard and Pat Nixon are both buried at his birthplace in Yorba Linda, California. Thanks for watching this episode of Forgotten History. If you liked this episode, please consider being a channel member or joining our Patreon page. This would help us offset the ever-increasing cost of production. As always, please like, share, and comment. And if you have any show ideas, please contact us, and we'll get back to you as soon as possible. Until next time.